Thank you. I'm really, really excited to be able to be here and present this today because at the first SingWell Symposium, I presented the idea for this project. And at the second SingWell Symposium, I presented about all the tools that we were trying to learn how to use to do this project. And now I finally have some data to present, which is exciting. But I had to title this an update because I didn't have any finalized conclusions that I could present to you as oh, this is what we found in our study. So I hope that you will forgive the fact that this is quite preliminary. Some of this data is so hot off the press that Alex just pulled it off the plate reader on Wednesday night. So it's very new data. But I wanted to talk about this group versus solo singing aspect. Of course, it is still very preliminary, but I think that the data has a little bit to speak towards that. I've asked this question before: how important is the group in group singing? Because the current literature that has compared group and solo singing has suggested that the group singing is more beneficial for health and well-being. And of course, we can think about potential reasons for that. It may be that there's just more extra mechanisms and moderating factors that are available in the context of group singing. There are certain things that you can do when you're a solo singer or a group singer that changes your breathing. There's movement that you can do. All of these things are possible, but it isn't possible. You can synchronize with a backing track, but I don't think that you can really synchronize interpersonally when you're singing by yourself. And of course, a group bonding isn't really going to take place. Another reason why group singing can be so potentially useful, it's thought to be an icebreaker, and it's useful for fostering and quickly developing social connections. So it may be that group singing is more useful than solo singing because it has all the mechanisms of solo singing plus some extra things. So that's what we're trying to look into here. The problem is, I did want to look at this in an unbiased kind of way because all of the previous research on group versus solo singing has looked at group singing and solo singing with people who have already been used to group singing, so existing choirs. What happens if you're taking your average person who may have done some choir singing in the past, but they're not currently singing in a choir, they don't really usually do group singing, and then you ask them to do some kind of singing intervention for their health and wellness? Is it necessary that they're in a group in order to reap the full benefits? So I wanted to look at this. So we developed this study where we take people who are not currently singing in a choir and who have less than 3 years of previous vocal training or choir singing experience in their past, and we randomly assign them to different groups. Now here, I have 3 different groups. This is how the study design was supposed to be. But as you all know, this kind of research is hard to do. And we thought that to start, we better just focus on the 2 groups that we would expect would be the most different, the groups that are the same, and solo singing. We also eventually had thought we might collect random groups of 4, where you're singing in a group, so you have the group benefits of synchronizing with others, but you're singing with strangers each time. So this seems useful to disentangle what's group bonding versus just synchronizing with others. But we're going to start by just comparing these 2 groups. Unfortunately, we couldn't use really large groups. We planned this during COVID when it was hard enough just to get ethics to allow us to put 4 people in the same room singing. And they come to the lab and we do a very large number of measures with 40 minutes of singing. They do some vocal warm-ups. A singing director helps them kind of learn the new songs and make sure that they're on track so that they don't have technical difficulties that are decreasing their enjoyment of the music. If they are like, I can't figure out what that line is supposed to be, the singing director helps. These were novel, short folk or pop style songs. They didn't know any of the music ahead of time so that we could control for familiarity. And they just used simple piano backing tracks to be able to stay on track with that. And these are the measures that we took. There's a very long list. So we looked at their self-reported and objective singing competence, their expectations of how much group or solo singing might affect health and well-being. We looked at self-reported mood, cortisol, We looked at their motivation and their sense of belonging to the group with the inclusion of other and self scale. And then we also took these continuous measures throughout the whole singing session each time: ECG, breathing, movement, and audiovisual recordings. We hoped to look at both pitch and timing accuracy, and also potentially do some facial emotion analysis. And I actually was presenting a poster downstairs, some work that I did with an undergrad student in our lab about that. So we ended up with 27 participants so far. I had hoped to have a lot more to present to you, but we all know this longitudinal research, it's hard to get participants. And they were fairly well matched on age, gender, years of music training, education, and their expectations for solo and group singing. And I just want to point out that the modal response for their expectations for both solo and group, they were equivalent and they were very high. So 7 on a scale of 1 to 7 was the modal response for how much they thought singing could help well-being, whether it was done alone or in a group. So obviously, we're all here because we already believe we know the answer to the first question: does singing promote well-being? But I think it's really helpful that in this study, where we're going to try to look at mechanisms and try to compare group and solo, we really should answer the question in our sample: do we see these well-being effects? And we had 3 main outcome measures that we thought could be sort of index well-being. So we had self-reported mood. We took stress hormone measurements using saliva samples, and then heart rate variability. And unfortunately, I was not able to get the heart rate variability data to show you today. We had some ongoing technical challenges, not with the data itself, but with the software we were using to try and segment out the behavior parts. So that is ongoing. But I can clearly tell you that we do see the expected well-being boost from before to after singing sessions in participants. They report being more happy and energetic. They also report fewer negative emotions, so they report being less afraid, less sad, things like that. And this is some hot off the press data. We actually do also see a general reduction in cortisol across from pre to post. So these are, sorry. So these are the individual participants, and because they had multiple sessions, in order to avoid inflating my N, my first pass look at this was not with a complex longitudinal model, but just by collapsing across sessions and seeing whether or not we see this decrease. Even without these 2 potential outliers, this is still a significant difference, and it's large enough that it seems to be much greater than what would be expected with the slight changes across an afternoon. I'm pretty confident that these changes are larger than what we would have expected to see if we were just measuring at 2 time points about an hour apart. So it's going to be interesting. This is not all of the cortisol data that we have, but if these results hold, I can say confidently, yes, in this study, we're seeing these well-being boosts for our participants across singing sessions. The next question I have is group singing better than solo singing in this data? And I can say so far, no. So we can see here, this is the solo is blue and group is pink. And we can see that the size of the well-being boost is actually perhaps even a little greater for the solo participants than for the group. And for this cortisol data, it actually only includes 4 solo participants. But if you remove this outlier, the means are identical for those 4 solo participants as for all of the group participants that we compared them to. So far, we would say that in this sample where people didn't come in with a group singing experience, the well-being that they experience after singing is roughly the same, whether for solo or for group. So we're hoping with all of those data streams that we have that we can speak to a lot of these different mechanisms that have been proposed to account for these well-being effects. And I had hoped to actually have data about a lot of these things, but as you know, data collection or data analysis takes some time. I'm going to focus specifically on this bonding question, though, in the few minutes that I have left here. And that is just to kind of keep talking about this difference between group and solo. We did see a trend. It wasn't significant, but it was clearly going up. It was, you know, one of those ones where you go, oh, it's almost significant. A trend toward an increased sense of connection with the group over time in our group singers. But when we look, there is no evidence of a relationship between the mood boost that they experience and the sense of connection that they have to the group. So that's just like, it's just a completely flat line there. And we do see that the sense of connection that they feel to the group is positively correlated with feelings of happiness, but it's the same significant correlation for both pre and post. So it doesn't really seem like it might be something more to do with personality or their baseline levels of happiness or their mindset when they're coming to the group, rather than group bonding and that sense of closeness to the group somehow mediating the effect. So far, I would say we don't see any evidence that group bonding is related to these well-being effects, but there are some big caveats to that as well. These are very small groups, and it may be that, you know, singing in a much larger group of people creates slightly different effects. And obviously, we're still just looking at this in a very simplistic way without any complex, like longitudinal modeling across sessions and weeks. So I think that there's still a lot more work to be done, but I hope that this is convincing for us to know that even if you don't get to sing in a group, singing is still good for you. And there may still be some group effects that are important for us to consider. But so far, yeah, singing is good. So yes, thanks to Isabel and the lab. This kind of data takes a lot of help and a lot of people. And thanks to SingWell for the funding and Brahms for their in-kind contributions. Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. And a plug for Alex for doing some late night cortisol analysis this week. Yeah. So time for questions. Yes, Bridget.
I'm Bridget. I was just interested in your expectations piece. I was wondering what you use to measure expectations, and also kind of a meta question, what you expect from the expectations data.
That's a really good question. We just measured expectations with a simple Likert style scale of, and we tried to make sure that people weren't biased into believing that we had a specific hypothesis. So we asked the question kind of like this. Research evidence has shown that singing in a group can help people's health and well-being. How much do you think that this is true? From like 1 to 7. And then we said the exact same thing about solo singing from 1 to 7. And everyone thinks that, of course, it's really good for them. These expectations were so high, we can't even use their expectations to model anything because there was like maybe 1 or 2 participants who had an expectation less than 6. So, yeah.
Question, and then so maybe it's a question comment. You found that there was a reduction in cortisol, and it sort of was framed as well. There seems to be no difference between group and solo, and I think whatever you find will be important and novel and interesting. But our current predictions are that we wouldn't see a difference between group and solo when it comes to cortisol. And our reasons for that, well, I would say that when we did the group versus solo comparison, it wasn't as controlled as what you're doing. We found that both groups showed a reduction in cortisol, but the group showed this increase in oxytocin. So, maybe there are some special well-being effects that have to do with bonding. It needs replication and controlled study, but that's our current kind of frame, that that the reduction in cortisol and maybe even the reduction, the increase in HRV has to do with the controlled breathing, the deep breathing that is necessary
Yes.
for singing as compared to normal communication.
I completely agree. I should have asked SingWell if I could do oxytocin too. Like that would have made a lot of sense to put that in here. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I think the hope is that we can see, obviously, that's one of the reasons why we think that singing is such a powerful tool, because it has so many different mechanisms that can all be playing a role. And I'm really excited to do some mediation analyses and try to see which of these mechanisms might be at play for these different kind of well-being effects. And so I agree 100% with what you're saying. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that the cortisol measurements so far, and again, this is only part of our sample because, well, Alex doesn't have unlimited time to run plates. But I would, one of the things that I was hoping to see is that maybe it was related to some of the other measures. I looked to see if it was related to the well-being, like the happiness. I looked to see if it was related to how much they perceived stress during singing, because we did ask them for a self-report of, like, I felt really stressed while singing, that kind of thing. There was no relationship so far with any variable I've looked at. So there could be other things that are mediating this that we haven't even looked at yet.
I was wondering if the solo singing condition was similar to a singing lesson, or is it just singing, they're asked to sing a song?
Right. It is a little bit similar to a singing lesson in that we had the director still in the room, just like they are with the group. We didn't want the groups to be undirected, because then if a leader emerges amongst the group, it gets a little bit awkward. So we decided to have them directed, to have a facilitator who helps them learn the song. And they did the exact same thing with the solo singers as with the group.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have to learn the song, they do sing along with a track that has a voice on it, whether they're in solo or group, a few times until they've learned the tune, and then they stop. So they didn't ever sing live with another human, whether they were solo or group. But you're right that there is that element still of singing with another person in the room.
Well, I wasn't thinking of that as the issue. I just wondered if it is whether you have any restriction on them singing alone during the week, like in between lessons.
No,
they could all be singing alone.
they could, you're right.
And so what you're really necessarily comparing is some kind of, it's a very specific experience of singing alone to this other condition in a way.
Yeah, it's possible. There were a few that felt like they had sung the songs enough times that they could sort of remember the tune, and they found themselves humming it during the week. People reported that they sometimes, they were desperate to find it. They would Google and Google and Google to try and find the songs. And of course they couldn't, they were novel songs.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Something to think about for sure.
Well, my question is a little unusual, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, but I'm sort of looking at, this about positivity, this, that, and, you measure different levels that the body is producing in order to know if they've reduced their stress or whatever. And I guess I'm cutting to the chase and saying it was brought on by the picture of the boys choir. And I thought, okay, so does this have any implications for reducing bullying and that sort of behavior when you've got people together and they're singing and that they're creating some sort of bond?
It's certainly entirely possible. I mean, the research that Isabel was presenting this morning showed clearly that after you've sung together, there's more pro-social behavior. So it could have implications for reducing bullying, but I don't know of any studies that have specifically tried to measure that. But.
Thank you.
Yeah. I went to Mike's choir school down the street. And you were bullied daily. No.
I was not bullied daily, but in a school where we sing together every day, 5 days a week, and then on weekends, bullying still very much existed. So not to me or from me, but it was very noticeable in the school. So yeah.
I was being silly. I think it's a completely reasonable concept, but it's just it's society, social pressures. It's complicated. It's yeah, I doubt that it would be as simple. It's really hard to apply this research in that way, but it makes sense. But there are other layers of complexity that might not make it so. Yeah.
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 And I mean, and anybody who's ever sung in a choir knows that those good feelings don't always last, and again and again,
Yeah, yeah.
because there are cliques in choirs and there are all sorts of things that go on in choirs. So anyway, that just came to me when you were talking, and I'm sorry, I didn't make it to rain on your parade, but anyway, I just thought, okay, what are the real life implications of this? Or
Yeah, no, this is mechanisms, and it's great because we're complementing the real life stuff with mechanisms. So let's move forward.